All right, we are ready for chapters 16 and 17 of the book of Joshua. And we will back up and review just a little bit of where we've been and look at our overview of the book, and then we'll get underway with those two chapters. Here's our review of the chapters we've covered thus far. Chapter 1 dealt with Joshua prepares for the conquest. Every time I look at Joshua 1, I think of Acts 1, of the disciples or apostles getting ready to go forth to preach or getting ready here for the conquest. Very similar in concept. Chapter 2, we have the spies sent to Jericho. And chapter 3, they cross over the Jordan. Chapter 4, the memorial stones, remember, set up in two places. And then there is in chapter 5, the second generation circumcised. Now that's an important principle, not a direct connection to our study tonight, but we see in that implied is a failure prior to their coming to the conquest to keep up with the commands of God. They'd failed to do that. And we're going to see some failures in that even tonight. They take Jericho, that's in this central campaign. Then there was the defeat at Ai because they didn't follow God's plan. We'll say more about that concept, not about Ai, but about that concept in our study tonight. They were victorious because they did follow God's plan in chapter 8. So that's the central campaign. Well, then we have the treaty with the Gibeonites, and we have the conquest in the southern campaign. Chapter 11, the conquest of the north. Chapter 12 dealt with the kings that were conquered, the list of the kings that were conquered by Moses and by Joshua. Then we have the division of the land to the east. And then we have the starting in chapter 14, the development of the division of the land on the west side. The land in Caleb inherits Hebron. We'll come back to Caleb a little bit later, at least in concept. And then chapter 15, we dealt with the land on the west, land given to Judah. Now, a great deal of information was given, or details given about the tribe of Judah that's not given concerning some of the other tribes. And we'll talk about why that may be here in just a moment. This is our outline that we're following from Wiersbe of the book of Joshua. There's the crossing of the river, and there's the conquering of the enemy, and we are in the third and final section, the claiming of the inheritance. Now the land has been conquered. Then there's the settling out and dividing up among the children of Israel. And so we're now in chapters 15 to 19, that section of the western Canaan, the tribal territories being assigned. Starting in chapter 20, we'll get into special cities being assigned. But by the time we get through with chapter 19 in a couple of weeks, then we're looking at the tribes have all been given their allotment and all have been given their territory, and they have their areas that they are to settle in and to drive out the enemy, which they do not do. All right, let's go to chapter 16 now. Chapter 16, in answer to question number 1, a short summary of chapter 16. Well, it would simply be the land that is for Ephraim. This is a part of this overall concept here of the division of the land on the west side of Jordan. We're going to look at a map of that here in just a second. Several times we'll go to the map. But we're looking at the land that's given to Ephraim here in verses 5 to 10. And verses 1 to 4, though, is kind of a summary of the one lot that was drawn for the children of Joseph. We'll talk more about that here in just a second. Now, before we look at chapter 16, let's go to a map just for a second. And here is the land that eventually is divided out among all the 12 tribes. And so here's what's already been assigned. That in the lighter shaded area, we have Reuben, Gad, and a half a tribe of Manasseh. Now, we're going to say more about Manasseh tonight, about who gets that part versus the part on the other side. And then last week we talked about Judah, large territory that's been given to Judah. Now, there's part of that going to be given to Simeon a little bit later we'll talk about. But that's what's been assigned thus far. Well, what we're focusing on tonight is here Ephraim and Manasseh. And this is the children of Joseph that we're going to be talking about, and that's what the point of these chapters. Now, I want to go back before we get into chapter 16 and talk about how chapters 16 and 17 are quite different from 14 and 15. Several scholars have made the observation that these chapters deal with uncertainty, confusion, and inadequate instructions. I don't mean by that, or I don't think they mean by that, they're critical of God, that God didn't give enough information and God didn't write this well. But what they're simply saying is there were great details given about the number of cities of Judah. And we talked about those cities and the territory and the exact description of the border, so there's no question about Judah. But when we come to these two assignments, or the children of Joseph to Ephraim and a half a tribe of Manasseh, then, as one author says, the border of Joseph is very slightly traced out. Another author said the material exhibits considerable disarray as if the order has been disturbed. And in the comparison, and some of the students, in fact, self included, has a hard time tracing out from the description exactly where are some of these cities and exactly where is the borderline supposed to be because of the lack of information. There's very little information given, as the detailed information seems to be given with reference to the others. Why is that? Well, the simple answer is, I don't know. A more involved answer that I borrow from others is perhaps 3 reasons. Here's what's accomplished. The main reason for that may be that God's emphasis is on Judah. That while he's going to show 2 things here in these chapters, not just 16 and 17, but all the chapters that we deal with in the outline we had a moment ago of settling on the east and then on the west, and they finally get it all. That he seems to be showing 3 things. Number one, the focus and the emphasis may be on Judah because it is of the tribe of Judah from which our Lord springs. And that's what the whole Old Testament is about, is the coming of the Messiah. So it may be, and there is some conjecture, I can't find a verse that says that Judah was the one that needs to have more detailed information than the other tribes. But it very well may be that the emphasis of the Lord was on Judah. That's why all the details were given. But then he's trying to show, the writer may be trying to show, and we think it is inspired. We're not saying the writer failed in this, but showing that all tribes did receive their territory. So here basically is Ephraim, here's Manasseh, here's Benjamin, here's Issachar, but the emphasis was on Judah, maybe. But also part of the emphasis of these chapters, as well as all of the chapters, is to show the failure of the people, and I might add a 4th point, is the fulfillment of the promise of God. In other words, God fulfilled his promise and gave every promise, but on the other side is man failed to do the job God gave him to do, which is drive out the people. So twice in our story tonight, they didn't drive out the Canaanites. And they didn't want to drive out the Canaanites, apparently. And we'll see more about that as we go on. Now, when we come to verse 1, let's talk about what happens in chapter 16. There's a lot of the information here. We could spend a great deal of time talking about the details of the southern border and the northern border and trace each one of those on the map. And by next week, we've done forgot where those cities are located. So we're not going to spend a great deal of time. This is not going to be the longest class we ever had because of the lack of information that's given in these 2 chapters. But we'll deal with what we've got. So here's what happens in chapter 16. Verses 1 to 4, here's the land given to Joseph's children. Verses 1 to 4. Now we'll come back to 5 to 10. Let's go back to our map, and so we can kind of look at it as we trace out some things in verses 1 to 4. So let's get to verses 1 to 4. Basically, 1 to 4 is saying this, that the lot fell on the children of Joseph, and then it tells where that was. And we'll come back to where that was. You remember how this is being done was that there's Joshua, and there's a man from each tribe, there's the high priest, and there's the casting of lots. And so a lot fell upon Judah, and they received their territory. Now the next lot fell upon the sons of Joseph as one lot. In other words, it wasn't a lot fell upon Ephraim, and then another lot fell upon Manasseh, but upon the sons of Joseph. And then that was divided among them after that lot. So when the lot was cast, who's going to be next to receive their territory? It's the sons of Joseph. That seems to be the point. Then the borders are all settled out. So verses 1 to 4 basically is telling us that it started at Jericho. Now Jericho, if I could tell you colors, but whatever color this is right here and whatever color this is, that's the 2 territories we're talking about. And it starts here at Jericho, at the region of Jericho, and basically you see Beth Horon is mentioned here at verse 2. And those are the 2 places, Jericho, that are at least available on this map. So basically what this text is saying in verses 1 to 4, without giving all the details, is the lot was cast to the sons of Joseph. And so basically starting here at Jericho, making its way around and up and over and back down over here to the Jordan River, these 2 areas, these 2 shaded areas right here, were the area that fell to the sons of Joseph. Now it needs to be settled between them. All right, so let's start at verse 5 now. We're going to jump back and forth from our outline to our maps. But here's here's the land that's given to Ephraim. And we'll talk about the size of Ephraim in a moment. There's 5 to 10. If you want to jot some of the information down, we'll come back to the separate cities. But let's get verses 5 to 8. The southern border is 5 to 7, and the northern border is at verse 8. So let's go to the tribe of Ephraim now. So let's go back to our map about Ephraim. And this is Ephraim right here. And I'm going to give you a larger picture of Ephraim in just a moment. Right here is a little larger picture from another map company. And let's just talk about what we have in verses 5 to 8. Now, I'm not going to trace every one of the names of the cities. Basically, verses 5 to 7, the border of the children of Ephraim, according to their families, was thus, and then he starts talking about the border. The southern border is given in verses 5 to 7. You see the upper Beth Horon. There's an upper Beth Horon and a lower Beth Horon, which is, here is the lower Beth Horon, and here's the upper Beth Horon that is mentioned. Bethel, which is not on the other map, but Bethel was mentioned earlier, right here in the middle of that circle. Carries us on down through verse 7. So basically, here's the southern border along the line that comes along, and Benjamin, and that's Ephraim is what I'm wanting. Benjamin will be mentioned a little bit later. But I want to look at verse 8 now, which is the northern border. The border went out westward and it ended at the sea. And this is the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Ephraim according to their families. Notice the phrase according to their families. I'm not going to make much comment right now. If time permits, we may talk about that later. But several times throughout this, according to their families. So here's this tribe according to their families. Now I want to move on to verse 9 now. Verse 9 talks about the separate cities within Manasseh. Now let's back up to this map. That here is Ephraim. We've been talking about the territory that's been given to Ephraim, but then there is the half a tribe of Manasseh here on the west. Now what's the point at verse 9? We're going to see more about this at verse 9 of chapter 17 a little bit later. But let's get verse 9 of chapter 16. The separate cities for the children of Ephraim are among the inheritance of the children of Manasseh, all their cities with their villages. So what's the point? That is, there was some cities for the people of Ephraim were some of the cities that were assigned in the region of Manasseh. So here were some of the descendants of, or the children of Ephraim, that is, that part of the family of Joseph. They were given some cities in the southern part of Manasseh. That's all verse 9 is saying. Now at verse 10, this gets a little more practical, so let's go back to our outline. I don't want to get lost on the map so that we forget the flow of. Here's the border of Ephraim, and then here's the separate cities in Manasseh, but they did not drive out the Canaanites. Now here's the failure of failing to follow God. Notice at verse 10, and they did not drive out the Canaanites who dwell in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraim to this day. That phrase, to this day, I don't think it suggests that it just ended forever and ever. It's an idiom that just affirms the certainty of that. In other words, they still dwell there, they are there, and they didn't drive them out. It's just an affirmation of the certainty that indeed they didn't drive them out and they still are there. But here's the point I want you to see at verse 10. God had told them to inhabit the land, and they were to drive out all the enemies. Now, we've talked about this several times. They conquered the land in the sense it's under their control. But there's still pockets of the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Girgashites, etc., all the ites that are there. And so when they settled their territory, they were supposed to go in and take care of their territory and drive out the Canaanites that were there. Well, they didn't do that. And they failed to do that. And that becomes a snare to them. Because with the Canaanites, it's still part of their idolatry. They were not converted to Judaism. So it's not like they went in and converted these people and now they're proselytes and they're worshipers of the one true God. These Canaanites are still worshipers of idols, and that becomes a snare to them. This is the very reason why they go into idolatry. Now I want to get ahead of myself to go to Psalm 106 along that line. Let's go to Psalm 106. We've appealed to Psalm 106. It's a historical psalm many times. And I want you to notice at verse 34, they did not destroy the people. But when they conquered the land, they were killing a bunch of the people. That's exactly what they were supposed to do. But when they occupied the land, now that it's been occupied, they didn't drive them out. So verse 34 4 says they did not destroy the people. Well, that doesn't seem too bad at first because we occupy the land. We're here. We're in control of the land. It's our land. And later we're going to see they made them servants and slaves. That seems like a pretty good compromise on the surface. But let's go to verse 34 again. Psalm 106, verse 34. Concerning him the Lord had commanded, but they mingled with them. The problem with not driving them out was that gave them an opportunity to mingle with the Gentiles. What's the problem with mingling with the Gentiles? Verse 35, they learned their works. What did that lead to? They served their idols, which became a snare to them, and even sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons. So here's the children of Israel who at this point of the time of Joshua are not even thinking or dreaming of ever taking their children and offering them to Molech. But how did that ever happen? Because they didn't drive out the people. They didn't see the big need for that. That's a lot of work. It's a lot of hard work driving them out. We're going to see that in chapter 17. They don't want to do the hard work. So they compromise. And when they compromise, that's the first step that leads to the next step, which leads to the next step, which leads to the next step. And the next thing you know, they are deep in idolatry and worshiping by serving the God with their own children. And that's why they went astray. Now, a couple of things before we leave chapter 16. Some places that are mentioned that are in Ephraim. Let's go back to a map, and some of these I don't think they're not mentioned here, and I didn't go back to trace and see if these were on the map here. Some of them are. But here's some prime cities or special cities that were in the region of Ephraim that are not mentioned here, and there's no need to mention them as far as the text is concerned. Samuel's city of Ramah is here in this region of Ephraim. It's also in the New Testament, that same city is called Arimathea. That's where Joseph was from, Joseph of Arimathea that took the body of Jesus. That's right here in this region of Ephraim. Shiloh is on the map. Jeroboam's capital, Tisra, is there. Samaria, that became the capital of the northern kingdom in its final years. It's right here. And so the northern kingdom is often referred to as Ephraim. Ephraim is joined to his idols, the prophet would say. It's talking about the northern kingdom. It became the seat of that. Sychar, which is where Jesus sat at the well. Those cities are right here. So this is quite a notable region for the children of Israel, but that's the land that was assigned to Ephraim. Now, to answer a question the graded ages have at some point, and that is the size of this territory. This is about 38 miles across, wide, and 20 miles north and south. So east and west, about 38 miles and 20 miles north and south, to kind of give you a perspective of the size of the territory. So this is not like the size of Tennessee. It's not that big. From one end to the other is about as far as from here to Tullahoma. So it's not that big of a territory. Let's catch up on some questions and then go to chapter 17. Question number 1 for the graded ages, what did the Ephraimites fail to do? Verse 10 was to drive out the Canaanites. And question 4 we've already answered. For the adults, where was the land? Question number 3 was where was the land of Ephraim? Just north of Judah. Is about as good an answer as you can give for that without giving all the territory. Just north of Judah is where they are. Question number 4, who did they not drive out? The Canaanites. And I think that catches us up on some questions now. All right, let's go to chapter 17. Let's go to chapter 17. Now, 2 things happen in chapter 17. This is the land given to Manasseh. And the land is talked about on both sides of the river. So notice, as far as the title of this chapter, I didn't talk about the land given to the Manasseh on the west or the east. Both are mentioned in this context, though the emphasis is on the west, and we'll get to that. So let's talk about the land given to Manasseh 1 to 13, and then we'll talk about more land for the children of Joseph. That gets a little more practical than some of the other sections we're going to be looking at. But several things happen in this section of verses 1 to 13. Machir received Gilead and Bashan on the east. Now, so let's look at chapter 17. There was also a lot for the tribe of Manasseh. That is, this lot fell for the sons of Joseph. It is divided between Ephraim and Manasseh. So beginning at, not beginning, but at verse 1, the firstborn of Joseph, Machir, who was the firstborn of Manasseh, the father of Gilead, he was a man of war. He was given Gilead and Bashan. Now that's talking about the land on the east side. So let's go to a map and find that on the east side. Let's go notice it on two maps. It's going to be talking about this territory right over here that he received, but I want to show it a little closer to give you the idea of Bashan. And right here, give you your bearing. This is the land. This is the Dead Sea right in this not the Dead Sea, but the Sea of Galilee. This is Bashan and Gilead. So basically, he was given that region, and for his descendants is what verse 1 is saying. Now let's go back to verse 2, and verse 2 talks about the other sons of Manasseh received the lands on the west. So the elder son received a greater portion. Verse 2, without reading all of the names, unless somebody wants to volunteer to pronounce all of those, I think we can pronounce them, but we're not going to try. At verse 2, there are 6 sons that received the land on the west side that we'll come to, and we'll map out here in just a second. We'll give you the descriptions and the width of all of that. Well, at verse 3 now, notice the daughters of Zelophehad and who was Zelophehad? That was a great-great-grandson of Manasseh. That's who that was. Now, let's go back to Numbers just for a moment and trace out what we have in the book of Numbers. Go back to Numbers 27, if you will. You might, if you don't have marginal notes, if you don't have the center reference column that traces that, this may be a good time to put in the margin of your text. This is found over in Numbers 27. Numbers 26 had dealt with the second census. And when we come to Numbers 27, we have the daughters of Zelophehad. The daughters of Zelophehad, that's the one we're talking about. They came and they stood before Moses, and without reading the entire text, look at verse 4. They said, "Our father died in the wilderness, and that he died and had no sons," verse 3. "And why should his name be removed from among the family? Because he had no son, therefore give us a possession among our brothers of our father." And so Moses told them that they could receive, and they would receive a portion. And that occasion, you remember from Numbers chapter 27, is being fulfilled here in our text. Now go back to verse 3 of our text. In verses 3 to 6, these daughters received the land. There are 5 daughters that are mentioned. The names of them are given at verse 3. "And they came to Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun, and they said, 'The Lord had commanded us,'" they're talking about Numbers chapter 27, "'and said we could receive an inheritance.' So 10 portions fell to them, and the daughters," verse 6, "received their inheritance along with the rest of the sons of Manasseh." So we have the fulfillment and the connection back to Numbers chapter 27. Now, at verses 7 through 11, the borders are given. We'll come back to this outline in a second. Let's talk about the borders of Manasseh. That's this larger area right here. This is West Manasseh. So we're going to be reading about the borders of this region. And so let's draw that up a little closer and look at Manasseh here on this map. And to give you, and this is an answer to the graded ages question, what is the dimensions of this? Well, let's get the border first, and then we'll get the dimensions. Starting at verse 7 and carrying us down through verse 11 without reading the details, it basically tells us that the northern border and the southern border and the north side and how it ended at the sea. Notice at verse 10, I want to come back to verse 9, but verse 10 talks about it adjoined Asher on the north and Issachar on the east. You see that right here. Here's Asher and Issachar. They're joined, and that's part of the borderline. Notice at verse 11, there is Megiddo mentioned. Megiddo was at a pass in a mountain range, which became a point for many decisive battles. Many battles were fought there. And it's based upon the number of battles being fought at Megiddo as to why we read about Armageddon later in the book of Revelation in other texts. It's based upon that concept. It's a reference to Megiddo. It's a place of many decisive battles because of the past. But Megiddo is mentioned right here, and you see it at the top of the map inside this circle right here is where Megiddo is, right in a mountain range, and it was right in a pass. But I just wanted to call attention, and it mentions its town and 3 hilly regions. So it was in a hill or mountainous region. Now, what's the size? To answer a question for the graded ages, about 40 miles east and west and 26 miles north and south. So about 26 by 40 or 40 by 26. Obviously, that's not an exact measurement because of the odd shape of that, but approximately 26 miles by 40 miles across to give you kind of a perspective of the size. Now go back to verse 9. And verse 9, and the border descended to the brook Canaan, southward to the brook, and these cities of Ephraim were among the cities of Manasseh. I think that's talking about the same cities that we talked about in verse 9 of the previous chapter. So there were some of the cities that were in Manasseh that those of Ephraim occupied, and that was their cities, even though it was in the region of Manasseh. All right, now let's go back to our outline and get verses 12 and 13. And here we have the same thing that we found over in chapter 16, and that is this failure to do what God had told them to do. Here we have a compromise. So what we have in verses 12 to 13, they failed to drive out the Canaanites. So let's get verse 12. Then the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites were determined to dwell in the land. Now, before we get verse 13, let's talk about what is that saying? Is that saying that they tried with all their strength and all their might, and they worked as hard as they could, and they just couldn't do what God wanted them to do? Or is it saying that they really failed to do what God told them to do? And I think the latter is the case. But you say, well, the wording of verse 12 is the children of Manasseh could not drive them out. But the command of God was they were to drive them out. And in Psalm 106 and many other texts, God condemns them for failure to drive them out. So it is not saying it was impossible to drive them out. It's much like saying someone who, if I said, I know someone who he couldn't give up his drinking. And he just an alcoholic, and he just couldn't give up his drinking. So am I saying that he tried, but there is no way possible, and he just failed in that, so God's not going to hold him accountable? No. It means his desire for drinking was much stronger than his desire to serve the Lord. That's what that means. It means their desire for compromise was greater than their desire to serve the Lord. It means their desire for ease and less work was greater than their desire to do what God said. That's what that means. They couldn't drive them out. Why couldn't they drive them out? Because they didn't want to drive them out. And it became a snare to them. Now, verse 13, it happened that when the children of Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor and did not utterly drive them out. That's a compromise. In other words, it seems at the moment that at least if we didn't drive them out, at least we overpowered them. And notice it's when they grew strong, as they grew larger and they grow in number, that they then have the power. They didn't have the strength to drive them out, but now they've got the strength. They can put them under their control, and so they make them forced labor, basically made slaves out of them and allowed them to live there. And that indeed was a compromise. It's a compromise because of their love for ease. One writer said that there were hundreds, if not perhaps thousands, of male and female prostitutes that would have been everywhere connected with their pagan idolatry. And so this was not an intellectual thing of merely not believing in God. This was a moral question now that is going to destroy their morality, and indeed it will, and it does. Now, that's their failure. Now let's go to the next section, 14 to 18, more land for the children of Joseph. We see their request, Joshua makes an offer, their complaint, and Joshua's response. This gets interesting. Verse 14. The children of Joseph spoke to Joshua and said, "Why have you given us but one lot and one portion to inherit, since we are a great people, inasmuch as the Lord has blessed us until now?" Well, they were a large tribe. Obviously, as you see in Numbers 26, they had grown considerably since Numbers 1. They were a large tribe, very large tribe. What's their point at verse? There's two things I want to focus on. One, they focus on their greatness. It may be greatness in size. Probably so. Some are thinking that they're not only focusing on their greatness in size, but their greatness in strength. We're great. We are a great people. And so why are we given but one lot? And Joshua, I want to get ahead of myself to get to verse 17. Joshua corrects, as one writer puts it, Joshua corrected that slander by saying it's not only one lot. So let's get ahead of ourselves to Joshua. Joshua said, "You're a great people and have great power." Perhaps that's why people think they're talking about power. You're a great people and you have great power, and you shall not have one lot only. Joshua may be saying you're going to get more. But it very well may be, as some are thinking, that he's saying, you weren't just given one lot. You were given a portion on the east side, you were given a portion on the west side, and then you were given Ephraim down here. You were given quite a bit of land, come to think of it. So he seems to rebuke them for that. They seem to be filled with pride here. We're a great people. And Joshua acknowledges you're great and have great power. But their request was that they should have more land. So verse 15 now, here's Joshua's offer. Joshua answered and said, "If you're a great people," almost a tone of ridicule in that, seems to me, but you take that for what you think, that if you are great like you say you are, I'm paraphrasing, then go to the forest country and clear yourself a place there in the land of the Perizzites and the giants, since the mountains of Ephraim are too confined for you. Now, what is he talking about? Well, let's go to the mountain and see where we're talking. Perizzites were in this region here, up toward Jezreel, up in this region. So there's a mountainous region. The land falls off as you go toward the sea, and it becomes desert as it comes back toward the river. But right through the middle is a mountain chain. And up in the mountains of the Perizzites, since this is not enough for you, the mountains down here isn't big enough for you, then go up here where the Perizzites are, and there are giants in that, and start clearing the mountain trees out and driving out the giants. And so get the picture. It seems like they come to Joshua and say to Joshua, "Joshua, we're great. We're a great people in number. We're great in strength and in power, and you're just giving us one little portion? Oh, wait a minute. You ain't just giving one portion. You're getting more than one portion, but if you're so great, then why don't you go up into that mountain region that's already been assigned to you, and why don't you start clearing the trees, and why don't you drive out those giants and that, and you'll have plenty of land if that's what you want." To be said, those who talk the loudest do the least. What a contrast to Caleb on the other side. Remember Caleb last week? He asked for Hebron. He wanted where the giants are in the mountain. He wanted mountains to climb and giants to slay. That's what I'll take. Give me where I've got to climb up the giants. I'll do that. And they didn't want to do that. Can you get some more land somewhere for us? Give us some more land. You've got land, just go take it and use what you've got. Clear the land. Kill the giants. Well, they object. So let's go back to our outline now. Notice what they say at verse 16. Here's their complaint to that offer. The children of Joseph said, the mountain country is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites dwell in the land and the valley and have chariots of iron. Both those of Bethshean and its towns, and those of the valley of Jezreel, of that region. See what they're saying? They basically make two objections to taking the land that Joshua had offered to them, and here's their two objections. It's a lot of hard work. And secondly, the Canaanites are there and they have chariots. Who's that sound like? Sound like those pessimistic spies back in Numbers 13 who said, we're not able to overtake it. And so their objection was, that's a lot of hard work. Now look at verse 16 again. All the Canaanites dwell there, and they have chariots, and the mountain country is not enough for us. In other words, this is hard work, number one, and number two, there are giants there. Well, yeah, there are giants there. Go kill them. Now, verse 17 and 18 to finish. Here's Joshua's response to that complaint. I already covered verse 17. And I'm paraphrasing. You got land on the east side, large section. And you've got Ephraim too. You've got a lot of land. But the mountain country shall be yours. Although it is wooded, you shall cut it down, and its farthest extent shall be yours. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have chariots of iron and are strong. More land. You've got land. You're just going to have to work for it. Quit your complaining. Quit your whining. Just go get the land and conquer it. Drive them out. What a practical section we have in verses 14 through 18. Let's finish some questions, go to some practical things, and we'll quit a minute or two early. Questions. Let's get the graded ages first. Question number 2 is, what did the children of Manasseh fail to do? Drive out the Canaanites. What was done with the Canaanites that were left in the land? They were made servants or slaves. We gave the size a moment ago of Ephraim, and we've also given the size of Manasseh. And what did the children of Joseph ask Joshua? Could they have more land? For the adults, let's see where we are. Question number 5, where was the land for the half a tribe of Manasseh? On the west, just north of Ephraim. What they failed to do? Drive out the inhabitants. Question number 7, what was done with the Canaanites? They made them slaves. Question 8, what did the children of Joseph ask for? More land. Those are the same questions we asked for the graded ages. Question 9, what did Joshua say to them? He said, you have the hill country, just go get it and conquer that. Let's get some practical things listed, and then we're done. Let's hear some practical things we learned from these 2 chapters. What do we learn? Well, first of all, I learned that if we're strong, we can do challenging tasks. That's what Joshua told the children of Joseph. You say you're strong? All right, you are strong. Then go do the difficult. Don't sit back wanting to take it easy. Do the difficult. So if we're strong, we can do challenging tasks. Secondly, failure does not mean we cannot. We notice in chapter 16 and 17, they failed to drive them out. Now, verse 18, we didn't talk about that a moment ago. We've talked about verse 18, but not in connection with verse 13. Verse commentary on verse 13, that when it says they could not drive them out, didn't mean it was impossible. It just means they didn't do it. Because Joshua turns around and says they're giants with chariots. Drive them out. He said you could drive them out. So verse 18 tells me what my interpretation needs to be of verse 13. Now, here's the third thing. Sometimes a request for more involves more work. It's like a child going to the parents and said, I want an increase in my allowance. Okay. You're going to have an increase in responsibility. Asking for more may mean more work. And they wanted more land, but they didn't want the more work. A compromise is not the same as following the law. Chapter 17, verse 13. Dangers may not always seem so bad at first. And I cite chapter 17, verse 13. When they failed to drive the people out, then they made them slaves. Now, it don't seem so bad at first. But when we get to Psalm 106 and see kind of a testimony, a summary of the history, it destroyed them. And so that compromise doesn't seem too bad at first. That little move toward the left may not seem so bad. It may be the very thing that leads to destruction. And then we see God fulfilling his promise, giving the land, and so therefore God does what he says. We'll stop at that. Chapter 18 next time.